Well, welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today is a Q&A with some very insightful friends. Our topic is quietening the mind. And our participants have watched the two podcasts, part one, part two, and you can see or listen to them at my website, drchris.life. But now I'll do a quick summary of part one before we go into our Q&A. So a quiet mind is a strong mind. And in these two talks, we'll examine why and how this is so. So in part one, we examine the reasons that having a quiet mind, why it's so beneficial. And then we'll look at two practices to induce that quiet mind: extended out breathing and a very simple mindfulness meditation. And in part two, we explore other applications: everyday mindfulness, interpersonal mindfulness, and using mindfulness to increase our emotional intelligence and thereby improve our emotional balance. So in our current life, this age of busyness and urgency, of multitasking and work overload, it'd be quite understandable to think that what's required of a person is a really switched on mind or a really busy mind. But nothing can be farther from the truth. The noisier the mind, the less productive it becomes. This is because it's actually engaging in what's now called switch tasking, incorrectly known as multitasking, which is really counterproductive. It degrades tasks, stresses the body and the brain, and actually takes longer. By contrast, a calm mind leads to efficiency, mental clarity, and high productivity. And central to this is mindfulness. And you hear a lot about mindfulness these days. What does it mean? It just means simply that we pay attention on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And when we practice it, we're training our brain to be less reactive and more objective. We become more effective at dealing with everyday tasks because we're less distracted, more aware, more observant. And why would we want a quiet mind? Well, there's a huge range of empirically validated physical, cognitive, and emotional benefits. And importantly, those benefits are reflected in increased density of grey matter in the brain regions linked to those functions. So, one method for quietening the mind is controlled breathing. And how might we do this? Well, what we want to do is modulate what's called the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. These are two branches of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic branch is often called the fight-flight system, and when it's operating, heart rate and blood pressure increase, the body accesses its energy stores, and it breathes faster to access more oxygen, all in the service, of course, of running and fighting. On the other hand, the parasympathetic system, often called the rest and digest system, is the other branch of the autonomic system, and is designed to quieten the body. So it lowers blood pressure and heart rate, reduces inflammation, stimulates our immune system and our digestion, leaving us calmer with a quiet mind. So clearly, it's worth cultivating this kind of quiet mind. And one technique that's really effective is to extend our out-breathing, which induces a relaxation response, which includes switching off that fight-flight system in favour of that parasympathetic system. So how do you do it? It's very simple. There's many ways, but probably the most simple way is you just sit comfortably wherever you are, and you might, for example, take a deep breath for a count of 4, and you might breathe out for a count of 8. No strain, no struggle. And if it starts to come easy, you increase the length of the in-breath and the out-breath. So you might do 5 and then 10 out, or 6 in and 12 out. And with practice, you get really excellent results in several minutes. The other most common mindfulness practice is mindfulness of the breath, just observing the breath. And again, you just sit comfortably upright, take a nice deep breath, let it out slowly. And here's one approach. You might first, and usually people do it with their eyes closed, but that's not necessary. But you might notice first the soundscape, the sounds outside you. Gradually paying attention to sounds closer to you and even sounds within you. And then you might find any location that can be in the nose, the throat, the chest, the belly, the back, where it's easiest for you to notice the sensations of breathing. And it's simple. You just begin counting breaths. You count 1 for the in-breath and out-breath, then 2 for the next one. And you might count from 1 to 10. If you lose your way, you just start from 1 again. And when you get to 10, you start from 1 again. Usually after about 30 or 40 breaths like this, you can simply observe all the sensations of breathing without counting. It's very important that you don't try to change the breathing. In fact, you're sitting back and waiting for the body to breathe. And inevitably, your mind's going to wander. That's normal. It's to be expected. And when it happens, you just note it, and now you're back, and you start observing the breath again. Sometimes it's also helpful to actually note what took your mind away. It could be thinking, it could be a memory, it could be an emotion, or it could be a physical sensation. And you just put a label on it, put it on the shelf, and come back to observing the breathing. All right, so that's a very quick summary of that first podcast. So I think now we should go to our Q&A. And here are my insightful friends. And I invite them to just share with me their insights or questions that they had from that part 1 of the Quietening the Mind podcast. Might start with Chris today. I think he normally starts later, so just keep him on his toes.
So I have a question for you about the process of mindfulness in general. So
yeah,
why is it sometimes, maybe you can help correct me or guide me in the right way, because sometimes when you engaging in some of these mindfulness techniques and trying to focus on the breath, it kind of feels like your brain is revolting against that process, like it doesn't want to do this. And that then, at least for me, leads to frustration, where the conscious part of me is like, subconscious part of me, why won't you just cooperate? So, which then kind of becomes self-defeating. It goes against the whole purpose of what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, why is it that we get that feeling like the brain is actively working against you trying to calm it down?
Yeah.
Or is that what it's trying to do, or am I just sort of personalizing that onto it?
No, I think anyone who's attempted these practices has exactly that experience, right? And in fact, that's an important thing to notice in these experiences, that in fact we have very little control over our mind. We tend to think that we're sitting here and determining everything that happens in our mind, but when we actually quieten down, we realize it's not quite like that. So that there's many answers to this question. As usual, your responses are curly. So the second thing, though, is I think that it reveals something of our nature, and that is evolution has wired into us a certain hypervigilance. And that's probably because the world for which we were designed, the Stone Age savannah in Africa, was a pretty dangerous place. There were things called apex predators that were thick on the ground. And so you can imagine that this idea of just sitting down and absolutely quietening and turning off that monitoring system, there'd be fairly powerful systems in us to maybe ward us off from that. But having said that, I can imagine that our Stone Age forebears, once they'd had a successful hunt or a good gathering and they'd a belly full of food and they're sitting together, would have been quite contemplative at that point. And I think one of the advantages they would have had over us is that they wouldn't have had a life that was so constantly stimulating and distracting. And they would have probably been more attuned to nature and that sort of calmness. So So I think it's a self-care mechanism primarily. And what you can do with that, of course, I mean, mindfulness of the breath is just an avenue into mindfulness. And the objects of mindfulness can be anything, including that feeling of frustration, which can just be noted. And then your frustration can be noted. Right. And it's cultivating this sort of attitude of what's called equanimity, which is this general okayness with what's there. You know, an error that we all fall into in mindfulness practices, especially meditational practices, is we're trying to change something. We're trying to fix ourselves. If we're stressed, we're looking to see if it's calming us down. And of course, when you do that, you know, I'm not there yet. And we start to get frustrated. Whereas the actual goal is to make room for everything and not react to it. So don't beat yourself up, I guess, is part of the answer as well. That's, as usual. Thank you, Chris. Fantastic observation. Who else?
One thing that, well, not one thing, many things, but the big thing that landed for me was the connection of wellness and the effects on our health. I think, you know, specifically North America, we have such a multitasking kind of conditioned society that having that realization that by even practicing the breathing techniques, becoming mindful, how that it has overall effect on your health. That just really landed for me. Not so much of a question, but just something big takeaway for me.
Yeah, and then this links a little bit to that part of my answer to Chris's question. This way we're conditioned to not be, you know, to not rest, to not quieten down, and unfortunately, we habituate to high stress levels. We actually don't notice it as stress per se, and it has deleterious effects on us. And when you practice mindfulness things, you begin to reset the thermostat, as it were. You know, it kicks in earlier. You know, at lower levels of stress, it tells you. It starts to tell you, and the physical effects are profound. And they're very well documented. So clearly, we are culturally speaking, I think, a bit out of balance.
Completely, yeah.
Yeah, you know, and we're not. You know, we need to be modulating with our sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. But we have a culture in a world that highly encourages and stimulates that sympathetic nervous system. Yeah, and so it's a very simple thing that one can do if one practices on a daily basis to increase our well-being. Yeah, beautiful. We've got Colleen and Terry. Yeah, Colleen. Yeah.
I hold you responsible for this because prior to being introduced to you, I felt that all of that multitasking or switch tasking, I felt very productive. You know, built a career of jumping around, thinking that you're accomplishing a lot, and now I find it harder and harder to not do that. I have to learn. It's learned behavior.
Yes. And Colleen, would I be right in thinking that in the attempted multitasking, it's kind of driven by stress? You know, it's driven by a kind of sense of, you know, deadlines and worry and so on. Is that right?
Yeah, deadlines, worry, and being responsible for others, not disappointing or not doing your job, basically.
Yeah. So from an evolutionary point of view, obviously, the fact that we do that is not only a feature of modern life. Obviously, this thing is hardwired in, and generally we call it hypervigilance. So the idea of hypervigilance, you know, might be in the ancestral environment, we'd be walking through the jungle or the savannah. You hear a rustling behind you. Suddenly you're on full alert, and your eyes will be darting all over the place. The mind will be jumping from one possibility to another, which in modern parlance we're probably going to call multitasking, right? So clearly there is a survival benefit to it. But fortunately, the scientific studies that look at working that way versus working with a single focus and with calmness indicate you can get actually as much or more done, but of a higher quality and not degrade your system. Yeah.
And I think there's a stress factor, but I also think that you can learn so much more. You're taking so much more in when you're doing it, more
mindfully. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really, really important observation, actually, because the way our brain is structured is if we're in high stress, we think actually a bit faster. And a way that you might understand that is we've got no time to ponder, to think deeply, to change some of our constructions. So we just run down the most used neural pathways very quickly because on the savannah you can't be sitting there like a philosopher contemplating, existential issues when there's a pride of lions who are stalking you. You wouldn't have passed on your genes, if you know what I mean. So that's another very important thing that there's quite strong evidence that mindfulness practices also lead to more creativity and innovation because it allows the mind to relax and to play with alternative constructions of things. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so terrific. What about you, Terry? Terry with the fish through his head.
As I focus on the fish going through my head, makes me think of, when I do strategic retreats where either individually or with a group of people want to talk about things that are forward thinking. I either come up to the cabin without the kids and in-laws around, or I'll take people fishing.
Yeah.
And the great thing about fishing, for the better part, you're not catching, you're fishing. Yeah. But what it does do is it makes people think about not a lot of other stuff and allowing there to be clarity, and it opens up a very good dialogue. And when that's done over multiple days, things evolve that you would never have thought of and that weren't conscious to you on day one turn into something on day 3 or day 4.
Beautiful.
And so it's kind of using, what you say, quiet down and slowly bring it in, knowing unless you're going to sit under a tree like Buddha, you're never going to fully get it down, but you get enough of it down that you can think very, very creatively without a lot of noise. And I find that to be sometimes my most productive time.
Yeah, beautiful. And a couple of things to say about that, Terry. First off, it's useful just to go to somewhere different. It takes people out of their normal associations and so on. But when in nature or in any way when we're setting a very safe, pleasant environment, people relax a bit and they become naturally more mindful. And so, for example, one way that plays out is they actually listen better. So they take in what other people are saying. And because they're feeling safe and comfortable, they're going to be less defensive about their ideas. And a hallmark of mindfulness practices, this quietening of the mind, is that people do become a little more open, more flexible, can change their view, more creative. It's classic win-win, isn't it? And it takes a kind of psychological maturity, I think, to allow ourselves in this busy world to actually do this. There's such a drive to be constantly on that we're actually missing out on the opportunity for this deeper, more strategic, work. And but one has to understand it deeply, so one has the courage, as it were, to do less for periods of time and to chill and relax. Yeah. All right, guys, that's absolutely terrific. I'm really looking forward to part 2 of this little mini series, where we're going to look at some other applications of this idea of quietening the mind and mindfulness. So thanks very much, and I'll see you soon.